Life is surprising, messy, full of heartache as well as joy and unexpected twists and turns, because that's what life is like for all the people we studied, and we think for everybody on the planet. And the reason why we want to underscore that is that it's possible to believe, especially when you're looking at other people's curated lives on social media, their beautiful photos and all that.
Right.
It's easy to believe that other people have life figured out and other people are having great lives, and I'm the only one who has times of struggle and times of confusion. And what we want to say is, no, we've never met a person on the planet who doesn't have that as part of their life.
There's an epidemic of false excellence out there.
Yeah.
And it's this veneer of polish, this veneer of shine over so many mental maladies and demons that we're all grappling with. You picked a fabulous wonder dip to enter because our guest in this one is an absolute sentient torrent of wisdom and kindness. Harvard psychiatrist, Dr. Robert Waldinger. He's the best-selling author of The Good Life, and he is in charge of, among many other things, the longest running study on human thriving ever conducted. They have been following people ever since childhood, on up through the later stages of life, and as a result, they've learned an immense amount about the factors that really lead to a good life, really lead to a sense of eudaimonia, of human thriving. And like I just mentioned, the other thing that really intrigued me about Robert Waldinger is that he is not just a psychiatrist at Harvard, he is a Zen master. He's an ordained Zen Roshi. So he's gone through intensive spiritual training as well. And that's given him a really unique perspective. And it's given him a really one-of-a-kind well of wisdom, I think. For that best-selling book that I just mentioned, The Good Life, which gets into all of this research in great detail, grab that wherever you procure your pages. And for more information on Robert and all of this research, there are links in the description as well. In the description, you will also find all of the necessary keyboard mudras for all things Third Eye Drops, including our over 300 audio-only podcasts with all manner of brilliant beings. So much love to our roughly 150 Patreon patrons. Patreon is the best way to directly support these mind melds, and you can also get involved. You can initiate yourself into the Wonder Dip because we do Zoom hangs with myself and guests you've heard on the podcast. There are also rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. We have a patron-only Discord and book club. Join in. And of course, friends, it is of paramount importance that you stop and you tickle the algorithm with a like, a sub, you click the bell button, comment. All of that is the only mechanism I'm aware of by which we can get noticed by this weird artificial brain that decides what other people see. And speaking of brains, let's meld minds with a wise, kind, wonderful one, Dr. Robert Waldinger. It is a true pleasure to meld minds with you. When the publicist reached out for this one, I immediately was like, yes, absolutely. I need to have this conversation. There are and the more I found out about you too, the more facets of your sort of personal life made me even more interested to talk to you. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, great. Thank you for doing this with me.
Let's kind of set the stage with talking about this research that you've been doing, because this is a really one-of-a-kind study in its duration and breadth, and looking at such a huge question like, what is it that makes a good life? What is it that makes a quote unquote happy life? Like, it's almost a question that seems like this can't be a scientific question. This is like a philosophical question. Yet, like I've said, you and your team and the previous, the front runners who used to run this study have gone to great lengths to try to make it into that. So please just summarize for everybody.
Sure. Well, it's a study of adult development, and it's a study of human thriving. not just happiness, if we
Right.
think about moment to moment happiness. So, and human thriving means physical as well as psychological and social thriving, right? So it's that big domain of how do people get through their lives in a happy, healthy way. And so I can say a little bit about the study and how it's put together. Would that be helpful?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So it started in 1938. And it is, as far as we know, the longest study of the same human beings that's ever been done. It began with two groups that didn't know about each other, a study of Harvard College sophomores, 19-year-olds, who were thought by their deans to be fine, upstanding young men. And it was meant to be a study of the transition from adolescence to young adulthood. And then the other study was of a group of boys from Boston's poorest neighborhoods and most troubled families in 1938. It was a study of juvenile delinquency started at Harvard Law School. And particularly, they were interested in why some children born with, so many strikes against them managed to stay on good developmental paths. How did that happen? And so both were studies of thriving, one very privileged group, one very underprivileged group. And then we brought in spouses. Then we brought in all their children, more than half of whom are female. So we have gender balance now, and we've studied over 2,000 people.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is an incredible breadth and such a really compelling topic for me personally as someone who's a bit of a philosophy nerd.
Mm,
As soon as I came across this ancient question of eudaimonia, like what it means to thrive, what it means to live a good life. I've always looked at that from a number of angles. And one of the things I was really excited to see early on in your book is you have this amazing quote about essentially the importance of challenge and difficulty in life. And I thought that I had clipped it out here, but I don't think I clipped it out exactly. But it's essentially something along the lines of the good life is not just a clean, simple, successful life. It's a sloppy life. It's a life of failures. It's a life of challenge. And I was so happy to see that because it seems to me that the role of challenge in a life worth living cannot be overstated. Like it
yeah,
really seems like it's required that we have these trials, these initiations, these times that we would like to think that we're gonna hit some sort of roadblock and transcend it, but sometimes not. Like sometimes just suffer a setback and have to integrate that and make sense of that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
absolutely. And one of the things we did in the book is we tell these stories of real people.
Yeah.
Their names are disguised to protect their privacy, but they're real stories. And we tell stories that reflect just what you're saying, that life is surprising, messy, full of heartache as well as joy and unexpected twists and turns, because that's what life is like for all the people we studied, and we think for everybody on the planet. And the reason why we want to underscore that is that it's possible to believe, especially when you're looking at other people's curated lives on social media, their beautiful photos and all that.
Right.
It's easy to believe that other people have life figured out and other people are having great lives, and I'm the only one who has times of struggle and times of confusion. and
Yeah.
and what we want to say is no, we've never met a person on the planet who doesn't have that as part of their life.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like there's an epidemic of false excellence out there
Yeah,
that I think we all are just like our personas are constantly interfacing it, and it's this like veneer of polish, this veneer of shine over so many mental maladies and demons that we're all grappling with, and I think are in many ways intensifying because we have fewer ways to cope with them, where our communities are breaking down, our religious institutions are breaking down, all of our sense making mechanisms are breaking down, and the only thing that's replacing it is this kind of false excellence, right? Like this, like you're talking about, this veneer of this perfection that doesn't really exist, that's just these like cherry picked moments with filters on them, and like smoothing technologies.
Yeah.
And that's not reality, or to be the most charitable, that's a very, very tiny portion of reality. And I think I'm just bringing up a whole just myriad of problems and questions here by pointing this out. But to you, having studied this so closely for so long, do you think this is introducing new barriers to doing something closer to thriving, or do you think it's just presenting the same old challenges in a new way?
That what's introducing that.
Like social media, this false
Yeah.
perfection, and
Yeah.
meanwhile kind of
Yeah.
being paralleled by the degradation of all of those
Yeah.
old sense-making outlets.
Honestly, I don't think it's introducing anything new, because when you look historically, I mean, certainly when you look at you know, the movie stars of the 20s and 30s, when you look at, there
Sure.
are icons. There have been icons always, where we want to invest those people with magical qualities and say
Right.
those people have it all figured out. And I think humans want that. We want somebody to be
Yes.
having the perfect life, because then we could get there, right? Think about the fascination with the British royal family and all
Right.
the, unhappiness we see, because we keep saying, really? Even those people who are so well off and have everything they could want, right? And so that's my long way of saying I don't think it's new. I think that what has happened is that social media, that the digital revolution has accelerated the ability to disseminate this kind of myth of perfection, right?
Right.
And that may be what's hard. The myth has always been there, but the counterpoints of looking at each other in real time and saying, "Oh, you're just another guy like me," right? I
Oh, of
can
course.
we can look at each other and say, "Okay, we're both human. We don't walk on water," and that kind of connection, that when you have more of it, reminds you, no, most people are just folks. I think it's easier when we are in these digital bubbles to to believe that the myth of perfection is real, because there's less to counter it in the
Yeah.
in the real world.
Yes. Yeah, and what I think is so difficult to tease apart in there is that I think we have an almost innate desire to appreciate excellence and
Yeah,
try to strive for excellence. Like, this is an ancient Greek idea that was heavily tied to this idea of eudaimonia, however it's
yeah,
pronounced.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, and it's like arete or areti. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but it's essentially this idea of appreciating excellence. And part of living that good life of what the Greeks called eudaimonia was like reaching your this excellence as a human, using all of your God-given or fate-given qualities to overcome and achieve something in your life, despite your weaknesses, and using all of your strengths. And there's something innately admirable about that. But at the same time, it's like this. I mean, you know this well as a Buddhist. It's like it's essentially like a fraught, ultimately uh, empty endeavor that I think at a certain point in your life you begin to reassess what that excellence means, and what
yeah,
it's
yeah.
for. And this is again something you talk. Go ahead, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, like, this is something that my Zen training has been so helpful with. Zen talks about this all the time, and many of the ancient Zen masters, in 8th century, 9th century China, were talking about just what you're talking about. So there's this famous saying: "If you meet the Buddha on the road,
Hmm. Hmm.
kill him." And what it speaks to is this idea that if you're investing somebody with these fabulous qualities, these ideal qualities, the ultimate enlightenment, um, uh, the ultimate place of nirvana, kill that person. Kill that person in your mind. Don't literally kill
Right.
that person, but
Hmm.
kill
Hmm.
the fantasy. Because what Zen keeps teaching is that the stories we tell each other do us a lot of harm, and they cause a lot of suffering when we tell these stories of perfection that are myths.
Yeah. Yeah, it's ultimately beyond all concepts, right? This notion of Buddhahood, of some kind of perfection in this life. And it reminds me too of this famous Joseph Campbell quote too, where he's essentially talking about, the road to understanding whatever you want to call it, God, the non-dual truth, the ultimate reality. The final thing you must do is kill your idea of God, right? Because
Yeah,
whatever your
yeah,
idea of God is,
yeah,
clearly it's not that, because we're talking about some kind of concept that needs to be disposed of.
yeah,
Um, if you really want to try to touch that place. But yes, what I was going to ask you before is, you point out that millennials that you've studied in this effort, this evolution of values over time. Like when they're younger, they predictably want things like fame and wealth. And then as they get a little older, they might still want fame and wealth, but it's starting to go down. And then as they get older, they sort of reprioritize all of that. And
yeah.
do you think this is something unique of millennials, or is this, do you think, just an overall human, not even human, just psyche development that
Yeah.
occurs?
I think it's not unique to you millennials. I think it's part of the life cycle,
Yeah.
right? So the life cycle is bounded by birth and death. And what happens is that the fact of death becomes more and more real to us as we get older. And so literally they've done studies of this, like in middle age,
Hmm.
people start to begin to really know in their bones, this is real. Like, I'm going to die and I'm not going to be the exception. And life really is short and limited. And what that does is it seems to actually make us reprioritize things. So that, and we've also had some experience. So, you realize, oh, I've had this, I've won these awards and they don't actually make me happy. And as I made more and more money, I didn't actually get that much happier. And so you have some experience to draw on.
Hmm.
And then you realize, oh, okay, actually, what I love is being with these people and doing these things. And so what we do is we reprioritize and we stop believing the cultural myths as much, and we start saying, okay, what do I actually care about? Can
Yeah.
can I bring in another Joseph Campbell quote,
Oh, of course.
which I love?
Bring them all on,
Okay,
please.
I think he wrote it. He wrote at one point, if the path before you is clear, you're probably on somebody else's
Yeah.
path.
Yeah. I thought
And
that was actually a Young quote. Maybe he
was
borrowed
it?
it from Young. That
Oh,
I
maybe
could be
he
wrong.
did.
I could be
Maybe
wrong.
he did. In which case, I got to look that up because I love using it and I want to get it right. So, but you're right, and I think what happens is we begin to say, "Wait, what is my path?" As we get older,
Yep.
Whereas I think when we're younger, we say, "Well, this is what people value." I mean, I'll tell you personally, like I'm a Harvard professor, right? And um, I'm in this institution that's all about badges of achievement,
Yeah.
right? And I'm totally susceptible to that. That has really shifted as I've gotten older. And I realize, that doesn't matter. The work I do matters and the people I'm with matter. But those badges, my professorship, uh, that doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean my colleagues don't matter and all that, but it's the labels that I've been able to see through, see beyond. I hope.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's still a work, a job for me to keep doing that, to keep seeing the kind of fundamental, sort of emptiness of
Yeah.
these kind of badges and myths of wealth and fame and achievement.
Well, hearing that from you really matters, because you've jumped through all of the hoops, my friend. I mean, you're
I
you're a
know, I
you're
know.
a psychiatrist, you're a Harvard professor, and you're highly respected. You have this great book, and that's sort of the thing you hear, right? Is that as you get older, like you realize what's really important, and it's not about achievement, but it really means a lot hearing it from someone like you. And I have to, speaking of Young, I mean, he talked about this, that at around midlife, this kind of descent, this introspective descent starts to begin as you start to realize, as you pointed out, I've physically peaked. So there's either something, there really is something more deep in the psyche, and I need to make sense of that and settle into that. Or perhaps, if we want to be more skeptical, that's just some kind of defense mechanism about that the psyche requires to make sense of its ultimate doom, or whatever it is. And I'm certainly more warm to this more mythopoetic interpretation that the psyche is going through some kind of a blooming process as the physical body is degrading. The psyche is doing something, and we have an opportunity, if we're courageous enough, to let go more of that persona based, ego based
Yes.
way of
Yes.
operating outwardly, to really do some soul maturation, some psyche maturation, that is ultimately the truer point of what it is to be human. And it seems like, so like I was alluding to before, that your own biography was really interesting to me. I was particularly talking about you choosing to really go down the path of Zen seriously, to the point of becoming a Roshi. And I want to hear the whole story, my friend, about how did that come into your life? At what point did you decide, I really need to divert from this path and go deep down the meditative introspective path? How did that all unfold for you?
Well, I was raised Jewish, and I loved being Jewish, and I love the traditions and the culture, but I never believed in the Old Testament God. It just didn't
Mm-hmm.
do it for me. And I can't. I wish I did, but I don't. So then it was like, but I was still really hungering for some way of kind of putting my life and the experience of being human into some bigger context. And when I was exposed to Buddhist ideas about, you know, about radical impermanence and, beyond the self, kind of all of that really grabbed me. But I couldn't, and I tried to meditate, but I couldn't get myself to keep meditating when I got busy or stressed, which is just when you want to keep meditating. But then somebody said to me, you need to find a group to sit with regularly, and you need to find a teacher. And I accidentally stumbled on a teacher. When
Mm.
my son had a friend who had a coming of age ceremony at the Unitarian Church, literally 5 minutes walk from my house. So we went, and the mom of the kid knew I was interested in meditation. She pointed to the minister and said, he's a Zen master. So I looked him up. I said, could I come talk to you? I thought this guy was lovely, down to earth. And I thought, okay, I could try learning from this guy. So I started sitting on Monday nights with his Zen group and studying with him. And that was like 18 years ago. And and it just led to this deeper and deeper involvement. I never set out to do this, but I found that it was one of the most nourishing things in my life. And so I still, it's still a huge, like tonight, tonight is my Zen group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I still sit with the same Zen groups on Monday nights. Thank goodness, especially with all this hype around the book. It's been really useful to be able to come back to the ground of meditation and being, and to cut through all the hype of, the book is a bestseller. And yes, I love that, but you don't want to believe the hype around that ever. You just want to say, okay, what that means is that more people will see these ideas that I care deeply about. And that's what really matters. It doesn't matter that it makes the bestseller list or not. It matters how many people get this book into their hands.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great perspective. And I still have to wonder, though. I have to push a little bit deeper on this
Go ahead. Go
line of
ahead.
questioning, because I'm just so curious. Is all of that makes sense, and I see that reflected in my own life in many ways. But not everybody who starts going to sit once a week decides, like, I have to become a Roshi. Like, I
Yeah,
have to,
right.
like, really really pursue
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Like, at what point did that happen for you? Because you have had this whole rigorous career, rigorous education as a psychiatrist,
Yeah.
and today. But what's funny is at the same time, I've noticed this in other psychiatrists and psychologists. This very there seems to be a very thin veneer between exploring the mind and like the deeper nature of being, philosophical questions, making sense of life. Like I just did a podcast with a psychiatrist, Anna Yusim, who from Yale, and she in a different way went down a very spiritual path while also being a psychiatrist as well.
Yeah,
So what
yeah.
was it? Was there something unsatisfying or unanswered from the sort of more logical pursuit of knowledge for you that you felt like needed to be pursued more introspectively, or was it not that
Yes.
overt?
No, it's very much that. So what happens, I live in a world of the mind, right? And both I do psychotherapy, and our psychotherapy is, so much about language and exchanging thoughts. Now, obviously, a lot of emotion gets communicated too, but but it's cognitive. A lot of it is cognitive, and my research is very cognitive. Um, what I found was that just the ability to drop into experience, to my bodily experience, to the experience when I first started meditating, of like looking at the floorboard in front of my cushion and realizing that the grain of the wood was just astonishing. It was
Yeah.
miraculous, right?
Yes.
That kind of experience I couldn't have as a psychiatrist. I couldn't have it as a researcher, and I was having it as a meditator. And that was what I wanted to have more of, and then understand and teach about, to help people. So my teaching, of course, involves words and language. And what I keep talking about is that is limited. That what we do is we use language to try to imperfectly point to the experience of being alive. But to really experience being alive, we have to be present.
Yeah. Yeah, and when do we ever get a chance to do that, right? Like that's one of those
Yeah.
things that I think in my own life I've always felt a very strong pull toward, and I've always felt a very strong questioning of these well-worn paths of, going to school, going to work, going to church. I just remember from as far back as I can go, like wondering, like, why? Why do
Yeah.
people do
Yeah.
this? Like, what are they getting out of this? Are they just coerced into doing this, or do they really want to do it? Are they really happy? Like, I've always had that sort of deep questioning, seeking impulse, and as I've gotten older, that's why I've just kind of this has become a bigger and bigger part of my own life because it's
Yeah.
really one of the only satisfying things to those questions. And I've certainly learned that I don't think there's a neat answer here. It's just getting more and complex and nuanced the more people like you I talk to. But what you're talking about with sitting and just radically being in the present, it sounds so psychedelic to me. It sounds so, you know, specifically this note about just appreciating the grain of wood and the beauty in the grain of wood. I've certainly shared that thought. And I have to wonder how that recontextualized all of your expertise as a psychiatrist and also your view of what you're doing
Yeah.
in this study because you must see, in because these aren't just numbers to you. Like you know these people. You deeply question these people over the course of their whole life. And do you ever kind of try to like stealthily introduce Buddhist principles to these people or try to like give them tools to be like, oh, you should check this book out or try this technique or anything like that?
Well, I do. I definitely bring a Zen perspective to my psychotherapy work. And I know that, particularly in the way I ask people to come back to the existential nature of their life.
Hmm.
So I'm constantly saying, what will this be like for you 5 years from now, 20 years from now? I'm sort of, let's step back and look at the big picture here. How much does this quarrel with your partner, how much does this matter in the grand scheme of your life? And
Yeah.
so I'm constantly pulling, and I know that's my Zen background. Um, And so, yes, it infuses it, and it infuses a lot of the research, not quite as directly as it does my work as a psychotherapist, but it definitely infuses both.
Yeah. Do you think being an introspective person like you've become and like a lot of these wisdom traditions offer us the opportunity to pursue, do you think they can fundamentally fit with Western capitalist lifestyles?
Mm,
Or do you think that they're opposing forces that once you start going down this more introspective way of being and experiencing life, you just sort of lose interest? I mean, the most extreme version of this, right, is the sort of like the Tim Leary angle of just of like I've seen something bigger and more important, and I just say no to this now. I choose to
yeah,
drop out.
yeah.
Um, or do you think there is a way that we can somehow commingle these two things
Oh,
that
yeah,
that quite honestly on the surface they do seem kind of like the principles are opposed, like the principles of capitalism and growth for the sake of growth versus this more present way, this more spiritual way of being and expressing yourself. Like
yeah.
what do you think about that?
I don't think they have to be opposed, and I think that bringing the kind of core truths of Buddhism into our secular life could do so much good. So, for example, like there's a quote from the Dalai Lama. He says, "The wise, selfish person takes care of other people." The idea that there is no separate
Mm, mhm,
independent
mhm.
self, there is only interconnectedness, and that the separate independent self is a myth. It's a helpful myth sometimes, but it's a myth. So if you think about that in relation to income inequality, if you think about that in relation to the hyper individualism of American culture, it could be a really good tempering influence, right? To say, wait a minute, we have to take care of each other. If we don't take care of each other, who's going to be which uneducated, unpaid workers are going to be around to help me in my old age when I need help? I mean,
Yeah.
it's literally that concrete, right? How could we make policies that foster greater inequality and concentrate more wealth among a small group of people when it will cause so much suffering, even for the wealthy people?
Yeah.
I mean, and so when you look at it through that lens, I think this lens is really vital to what we do. Now, you could call me, Pollyanna. I think, you remember Marianne Williamson's candidacy for president? She was
Mhm,
trying to
mhm.
speak to this. She
Right.
didn't think she was going to be president. She was just trying to speak about this stuff, about
Yeah.
collective well being. So anyway, so I'd say let's keep trying to bring this into our secular lives.
Absolutely. And one of the things that whole vacuum of sense making, that I spoke about earlier, that us not having like religious institutions, agreed upon myths, ways of making sense of the world. One of the things that's done is left a huge vacuum of myth, and I don't mean that in a when I say myth, I mean it in the Joseph Campbellian
Yeah, yeah,
Jungian way, where like these are
yeah,
deep. There's like this deep need in the psyche, and perhaps even really these archetypal forces that exist that need to be expressed. And I think right now that's what we're facing is like the vacuum of a really good unifying myth. And that
mm,
could be it,
mm,
maybe like something
yeah,
where we really are this one organism, if you want to call it that, this one consciousness. Maybe I would prefer, and then the division of that consciousness is illusory. I mean, I think science is even telling us this, and I think metaphysically
exactly.
that's perhaps the truer reality in a sort of panpsychist some kind of way, or something. And I don't
Yeah.
I again I don't know if that quite fits with the American individuality myth, but I think there's a way where it does. And I think that what it is there's a sort of it's the more kind of Have you ever read that Warrior's Path on the Shambhala on the Warrior's Path book by Chogyam Trungpa?
I've read parts of it. I haven't read the whole thing.
It's sort of like reframing warriorship in that way, where it's like a defeat of your own ego, that you're like your will, that's like the dragon that your will is overcoming it, like being subdued by the ego versus you're able to transcend the ego and operate in the world in this more um giving, loving way. I forget the exact phrase that he uses, but essentially it's the opposite of a scarcity mentality. It's
Yes.
this like sun like altruistic mentality that you can somehow achieve through this pursuit. And I think that kind of a myth is a real, for me it's a really potent one, trying to transcend and become an agent for this kind of giving that you're talking about.
Yes. Yes. And if that's because the individual, we all operate according to myths. Like the human mind can't fully grasp or absolute reality, if there
Right.
is even such a thing. But we know that what we perceive and what we grasp is a set of stories that may correspond more or less well to what's real, but that they are stories. So I agree with you. I think we need a collective myth that that is more healing and brings us more together, because we are going to operate. We are operating according to myths. My experience is that the myth of individualism, the self-made man, is really toxic and destructive to our collective well-being, and that we really need to call that out. And but that to find a collective myth that works, that's the hard thing. Religion tries to do it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, each religion has a set of myths, and that provide comfort and solace and inspiration to people. Um, but they often don't, well, they certainly don't work for everyone, and they often end up excluding and being exploited for non-healing purposes. It's unclear whether we would get to a place where we could all buy into a collective myth. World War II might have been one of those collective times
Hmm.
when we said we're the good guys, and we were closer to the good guys. Like when you put us next to Nazi Germany, yeah, we probably
Yeah,
were the good guys.
we look pretty
That's one
good.
of the few times in history where it was almost true, right?
Yeah.
We're never totally the good guys, but as we know, right? But that was closer, and it was inspirational, and the country came together. And people came together with people who were very different from themselves to be soldiers together, that kind of thing. Um, but how do we galvanize around something that we can all get behind? That's what's really hard right now.
Yeah. Well, I should be asking you that question.
Mm.
You seem like the person who's more cut out to answer that question than me. But I will kind of divert it back into the larger topic, which is, if we can't collectively settle on this, how can we find it more individually? Like, how have you seen that meaning making
Yeah,
process play out through the course of this study, if at all, if that's something you even measure for?
yeah. No, we did. The psychologist Eric Erickson, who was one of the first people to really say there are these stages of adult life, rather than saying, you're done when you get to your 20s. Child development is done, and then you're just who you are, and that's it. Erickson talked about these transformations we go through. And he talked about this phase starting in midlife of what he called generativity, where we come to care about the well being of the next generation, the well being of other people. So, could be raising children, it could be mentoring people at work or in the community, but it's caring about the well being of people beyond the sphere of me and mine. And that seems to be an essential part of developmental life for the people who find meaning and purpose as they get older, and who don't sink into despair. right? Because
Yeah.
otherwise it's just, I've collected all these toys, these badges, and I'm going to die. So what else is there? And if you can say, and many people did when in our study, we said to people in their 80s, we said, as you look back on your life, what are you proudest of? And to a person, they all talked about their relationships. It wasn't, I made a lot of money, I was CEO of this company, none of that. It was, I was a good partner, I was a good boss, I was a good friend, I was a good mentor, right? It was about the people. And I think that's um, when development goes well in a healthy way, as we get later on into our adult lives, that's where it goes. It goes to a concern for what is beyond the self, that we
Hmm.
care about, that we love, that we want to have thrive in the world, even after we're gone.
Yeah, that really makes sense. It's like a transition from the small s self to the big S self, like understanding that there's this underlying fabric of not just you and your life and you and your psyche, but in the collective, and that you see your impact on the collective a lot more clearly, I think, as you get older. And I feel like I'm very much, I think, earnestly beginning to enter that stage of my own life. I'm in my later 30s now, and I told you I quit my day job
Yeah.
recently, and it feels like I'm personally in this multi-dimensional kind of liminal space where I've literally quit one thing and moving into something else, and then also in my larger life, I'm literally moving more into this next stage that very much feels uh, foggy and like a dark, sort of mythological dark forest Campbellian moment or something.
Yeah.
And I think it's to project my own mind out into the world. I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast kind of feel like they're in that place in their
Yes.
life, the sort of like, I'm in my either quarter to midlife, maybe not crisis, but sense making period. And I'm looking for ideas and practices and things that are actually going to feed that deeper part of myself. And there's maybe a little underlying sense of, so what do I do? So what do I reach
Yeah.
for? What
Yeah.
do I practice? And I would have to imagine that for you, both in your clinical practice and in the studies you do, you see this playing out in a lot of different ways, and you probably are compelled to speak on that or give advice on that often. So what advice would you give personally with all of your myriad of expertise on people who feel that way right now, and people who are looking for to have a more soulful, more meaningful, more purposeful life, but aren't sure what to do?
Yeah. Well, I love what you're describing because people have actually studied this and this idea of being in transition. And you're
Yeah.
saying you're right now in a life transition, right? And that means you're letting go of some things that were an important part of your life, and you don't know what you're moving into. You don't know what the next phase of your life is going to look like. And what they talk about, when they study lots of people, is that first of all, these kinds of transitions are very normal, and that there is this phase, this middle phase where you've let go of the familiar, you don't know what's to come, and you're in this phase of uncertainty, this not knowing. And the the wisdom that I hear from people who study this is to let yourself be in that phase of not knowing. It's don't don't rush
Hmm.
to foreclose it. Don't rush to come to some quick solution. Feel your way into what's right for you next. Um, Try things, give them up quickly if you don't like them, if they don't resonate for you, but let yourself have that time of not knowing, even though it makes us anxious to be in that place, right? It's like, I don't know, I want to know what's going to come. And so it's tolerating uncertainty that can be really helpful at this point, and to know that it's normal, and to know that it won't stay forever.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that advice, and I resonate with that advice definitely. And I think I also, there's part of me that wants to to push against it. And I think where that part of me is coming from is that and I think everybody, again, speaking for this hypothetical collective listening, is we feel like, no, you're not supposed to be in that in between phase. You're supposed to
Yeah,
be
yeah,
going somewhere. You're supposed to
yes.
be on the way to something. And if you're not, there's something wrong and you're
Mhm.
stunted, or what are you doing? And maybe there's a balance that needs to be found there, but between directionality and really allowing yourself to incubate and metamorphosize and mature. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that, you know, we don't wanna just wallow um, in confusion. But I think that the wisdom might be to stay active, stay
Hmm.
exploring, rather than sitting still. Just keep at your own pace, exploring new things, seeing what do I like this? Do I like that? What's this thing is available? Let me go check that out, and just to try things, and to allow yourself to be surprised at what comes along. My Zen practice has made me a believer that the universe often brings things to us when
Yeah.
we need it. It sounds a little mystical, but I sort of believe that that's often the way it works. And so the idea is to stay open to what's coming along,
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
because we don't know what's coming along. And we actually have a lot of stories in the book about that. We have a chapter called It's Never Too Late, where people thought that their lives were done, foreclosed, their relationships were never going to be better. And then things change.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I haven't gotten to that chapter yet, so I'd love to hear some anecdotes about that. But I was thinking the same thing when you mentioned your Buddhist teacher just kind of popping out right when you needed them. And what's funny is, again, that other psychiatrist, Anna Yusim, that I just mentioned, she has a very similar story where she was kind of going through a dark night of the soul. I think it was during her residency, and she was like questioning a lot of things. And I've jumped through all these hoops, and like I don't feel fulfilled. And then boom, like she had an almost mystical experience that changed her idea of what's possible in life. And I totally agree. I've had, and it seems also to be like an amplified when you go outside of your comfort zone, when you're doing something where maybe you're traveling and you're not sure, or you're going to a new place and you're maybe a little bit more aware, and then something just very strange or some kind of weird synchronicity occurs that almost does feel like a wink from the universe you can't ignore. And I don't know what else to call it but that if you're open to it and you are really doing that exploring, like there are these things that emerge. I don't know if there's a word that is perfectly fits it, but I think things like synchronicity are starting to get close. And
Yeah.
I would love to ask you metaphysically, like what you attribute that to, or if Buddhism has ways of explaining that, or how you think about it. But
I don't know. And, it may not be that there is a mystical force that's delivering things to our doorstep. It may, like the Amazon delivery truck.
yeah, right.
But it may be that a kind of openness. Like one of the things when I look back on my life, like I got fired from one of my first jobs. I was told, there's really not going to be a future for you here. And I was like, oh, God. So I took another job, and sure enough, I met my first research teacher there. And then I was like, I never dreamed I was going to start doing research. And so I think it's really, perhaps it's not that things get delivered to us, but it's a kind of being open, watching, seeing what's around and saying, okay, that's here. Why don't I just go check that out? It's maybe perhaps the spirit of openness that allows us to see what's always coming along that we might choose from and try out. Maybe more than that, there is a kind of force actively constructing my life for me. I'm not sure I believe that, but this
Hmm.
this spirit of openness, which I have sometimes and not all the time, depending on how I'm feeling,
Yeah.
but that when I can channel that place of openness, more good stuff happens.
Yeah. That definitely makes sense. Yeah, I go both ways. I feel like I am smack dab in the middle of the woo. Things are happening for a reason. We're being possibly puppeteered by forces we don't understand, and
Yeah.
then a lot of the other time I just have no stomach for the wooey
Yeah, yeah,
5D
yeah, yeah.
manifestation. Like it can go way too far for me. So I feel like I'm right in the middle, and I'm always trying to find that line that feels intuitively right without diluting myself, and just realizing, hey, you don't want to live in a chaotic, nonsensical universe where there's no care whatsoever outside of yourself. So people will believe all kinds of things. I'm always trying to ride that line personally. But I would love to hear some of these stories you mentioned about people who felt like perhaps like, well, I had my last crack at it, or I'm never going to find the thing that's right for me or the person that's right for me. And then suddenly something happened. Can you share some of those stories?
Yeah, I have one that's just super mundane. So this was a guy. He's in the book um, who had a kind of ho hum, not very happy marriage, kind of distant, and he didn't have friends. Really, didn't have any friends, and he thought, this is just not happening for me. And then he retired. I think he was forced to retire in his 60s. And he thought, oh, I should get some exercise. So he joined a gym and he found a group of friends at this gym. Totally unexpected. People he really enjoyed. He had stuff in common with. They started doing stuff socially, and he found a little tribe. And he wrote to the studies saying, I never dreamed this was going to happen for me, at this age, at any point in my life. And so that's just one of those examples. It's not it's not surprising. There's nothing magical about it. It's just like one day I joined a gym, and guess what? I found some simpatico people.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
it's beautiful, and at the same time a little bit sad, because it shows that at any point if you just put yourself out there,
yeah,
maybe we're a little bit afraid or anxious to do it, but more often than not, probably good things, or at least neutral things, are going to happen if you put yourself out there.
yeah,
And it's yeah, and I think that that's a great both example of it's never too late, but also right now is also a good time. It's like you don't have to wait.
right
Right now is a
now,
good time too.
right now.
Yeah. Um, so one of the things I really wanted to ask you about too is, although I'm definitely with you on that earlier question of, that kind of kicked all of this off, where I asked you, how millennials' ideas about what a good life is change over time, or what their goals are change over time, from wealth and fame to these kind of bigger, more life satisfying ideals. However, at the same time, there are a lot of things that are changing. We talked about social media a little bit, and how that's got to be having a huge impact on the mental health of the world. And I think there's plenty of studies to bear that out at this point. But one of the things that I am personally curious about is the generation coming up now that is just primarily screen time and living in this new dimension of the digital. If you had to project out 5, 10 years in the future to when this population matures, what do you think that's going to look like, and what do you think that's going to mean for thriving or
Mm.
not thriving?
Well, I'm worried about the metaverse.
Yeah, right.
I'm worried that we may start spending more of our lives online. And um, one of the difficulties with that is that the metaverse seems to have some of the nastier, can have some of the nastier characteristics of social media, in that there isn't the accountability you can feel when you're in person with someone. You can say anything. You can virtually do anything, and that can cause a lot of hurt without any consequence. You don't have to really look at the other person and see the reaction. And so the worry that I have is that if we do say, okay, we're going to transfer a lot of our experience online, that we're going to shift away from some of the more human safeguards that we have in human interaction, just by having to look at each other and watch how people respond to us.
Mhm.
So that's all. That that is to say that I do worry about what the consequences of this are. Still, I think that the fact of death, which is not going to change, is going to inspire us to shift those priorities. And even if it's all online, we may become kinder online um, as we get older. I
Yeah.
don't know. And that'll be an interesting thing to study. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
some of our national public figures have not become kinder online as they age. That's very clear. But
Yeah.
that's those may be outliers, and that we may see a kind of whole span of human development that's new for people who are mostly in the digital world. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the practices like the ones that you have become so fluent in, meditative practices in general, become more and more vital as we get more pulled in the opposite, what I think is the opposite direction, with
Yeah,
all of these sort of dopamine tickling options that are out there. It's like the imperative to slow down has at the same time never been more intense, but less stressed. I mean, there is no one. I mean, if you're looking for the voices, there are plenty of voices telling you you should meditate, but it's certainly not something that's taught in school. It's not a fluency that we develop over time. And I feel like that's something that needs to be stressed as we go forward here, is like giving people from a young age the tools to understand that inner world, interface with that inner world, slow down to a point where it's like we talk about meditation just like we talk about exercise. We talk about
yeah,
working with emotions and being in your emotions just as much as we talk about being in your physical body. And I part of me is hopeful that there might be things on the horizon that are going to make that more likely. We have like this psychedelic medicine revolution happening. We obviously have the proliferation of a lot of these Eastern thoughts happening, but it's certainly not getting amplified like some things are. Have you
yeah,
thought about that? Like how we could educate that and prioritize that?
yeah. Well, um, there is this whole field of socio emotional learning, and you may know about it.
Not
Essentially,
specifically.
they've developed curriculum for kids at all ages, from kindergartners on up, that basically says this is what feelings are. Like,
Mhm.
this is what anger is. This is what excitement is, right? And this is what it's like when I get mad at my friend. This is what it's like, and they talk about bullying, and they talk about, and they teach kids about human interaction. They teach kids essentially emotional intelligence, interpersonal skills. They're well developed. They've now given these classes to tens of thousands of kids around the United States. And what they find, actually did a big meta analysis of this, published in a journal called Child Development,
Mhm, mhm.
that showed that when you educate kids in this way, it might be just like a several week, 1 hour course or something that teachers deliver to the kids, that kids are happier. They fight less with other kids. They get their discipline problems go way down. Older kids get less into drugs and delinquency. There's just so many ways, and their reading scores go up and their math scores go up.
Hmm.
So when you give kids this education, and that's important because many parents are worried. I don't want you teaching my kids values. I
Yeah.
want my values.
Or
Some
meditate, like, I mean, oftentimes there's this conflation of, or like
exactly.
meditation and yoga with like, "Ah, don't teach my kids this religious stuff."
Exactly, exactly. And so I think what we know is that this stuff works. We've got good science behind it. Thousands of kids studied. And the question is, could we get more of this into our schools every year? right? So
Hmm.
you start, I mean, they teach meditation to kindergartners. And what the teachers say is that our kindergartners start saying, can we have a timeout? Can we have they'll call it different things in their class, but they
Yeah.
know that they can calm their own overexcitement by sitting down and closing their eyes and breathing. And what a resource to give a 5 year old, and to have that 5 year old know, I can have this anytime I want. It's free and it's always available to me. So
Yeah.
so it's possible. The question is, and there's a collaborative that my friend Tim Shriver runs. It's called the Collaborative for Academic and Socio-Emotional Learning. CASEL, CASEL. You can go to their website. And it is a place where, scholars and teachers and, people come together and kind of share resources around this kind of programming.
Beautiful. Yeah, and as you were saying that, it really struck me that it's a lot of adults need this too. It's not by
Oh
any
gosh,
means
yes.
just the kids. It's like we all need this. We all need to understand how to place value on this in a sea of noise that's not going to encourage it or tell you it's something you must do or whatever. I mean, I worked in some offices during my day job where there was like a meditation room or something. No one was ever in there, Dr. Waldinger.
No,
No one was ever in
no,
there. And
no.
it's I try to understand how we get to a place where that room is busy and people value it and people
Exactly.
really
Exactly.
understand it. Like I could launch it to a whole thing here, but I won't. But instead
Yeah, yeah.
what I will do is before we wrap up, I would love if you could just share a few rapid fire things that you've learned over the course of this study and practices and career that you think are vital for people or that you see in common with people who score highly on these measurements of living a good life.
Sure. Um, well, one thing is that in relationships, these are people who attend to their relationships actively.
Hmm.
So, like, literally, reach out to your friend who you haven't seen in a while and just send them a text. Make a date to go for a walk. Just keep that kind of active, what we call social fitness, where you don't let your relationships wither away from neglect. So that's something we can do. And the people who stayed the happiest did that. Um, the other thing that people did, particularly in long relationships, marriages, for example, is that they accepted the fact that each of us is always changing, right? So when we allow other people to change and other people allow us to change, and we kind of embrace that, like you're going through a transition in your life right now. If
Hmm.
your
Hmm.
friends and your loved ones allow you to do that and are supportive, that's terrific. If they say, how dare you have quit your job? And you're wrong, that's the please don't ever change approach to relationships is one that makes us unhappy.
Yeah.
So we want to support each other in the kind of evolution of our own lives and the evolution of the relationships then that we have with each other. Um, so those are two of the big kind of takeaways that we get from looking at all these lives.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so simple, but it also sounds so powerful.
Yeah,
It really makes sense if you feel like your loved ones are just holding space for you to become the best possible version of yourself. I mean, what's more powerful than that? I mean, that's beautiful. And I
yeah,
mean, I really
yeah.
your whole work, this whole book is beautiful, beautiful stuff. Um,
Thank you.
what do you have going on now, or that you want to point people toward aside from the book? Is there anything?
Um, well, I mean, if people want to listen to Dharma talks I give, I'm on Insight
Oh, great, great,
Timer
great.
as a teacher. So you can
Oh,
go to
cool, cool.
Insight Timer, the app, and I have stuff there. If we are developing a program for people to kind of check in on their own lives, and we talk about things like transitions in life and meaning and purpose and relationships. We're hoping to bring that out soon. We've developed it and we've run pilots of it, and it's been really a great thing. So we're hoping that will come soon. It's There's more information about it at our Lifespan Research Foundation website. So those are a couple things you could look at.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you for doing this, Dr. Waldinger. It's been a pleasure.
This really was a pleasure. I so
Thank you so
enjoyed this
much.
conversation. Yeah, thank you.